So most of you are probably familiar with TOTP, time-based one-time password scheme used often as a second factor for many online services. And the way that this scheme works is that the user first enrolls by scanning some QR code with his phone, and later he can generate one-time passwords, usually encoded as 6-digit codes, using his phone, and type it into the machine on which he's authenticating. And the way that this scheme works under the hood is that it is a symmetric key scheme in which both the client and the server can use the secret key to generate an HMAC tag over a time-based counter. The client then encodes several bits of this tag and passes it to the server, and the server can verify these bits using the tag that he has generated himself. And as you can already see, this poses kind of a problem, since using this scheme requires having the same secret key both on the client and the server. And if the server gets hacked, then the attacker can gain persistent access to the same service because he can generate one-time passwords using the secret key he has stolen. And this is not a purely theoretical risk. In fact, a famous example of this happening is when RSA company got hacked and the keys for their one-time password scheme were stolen, and this was later used to breach to Lockheed Martin. And only last year, another cloud company got their one-time password secret stolen from the server, and again, this was used to attack their clients. So obviously, we would like to move away from this scheme that has this limitation. Well, there are some alternatives that don't require us having secrets on the server. For example, you could use dedicated hardware tokens such as YubiKey, which use public key crypto, but the disadvantage of that is obviously you have to deploy dedicated hardware, which is a disadvantage at some settings. You could also use online authentication apps such as Duo or the Google app, in which the user can confirm his login by tapping on a prompt on his phone. The downside of this approach is that it requires an online connection between the second factor device, between the phone and the server. And although this is a reasonable assumption in most cases, most online services still fall back to an offline scheme that allows the user to generate a one-time password without having his phone online. So in this work, we present Tiki, a new one-time password scheme designed to be a drop-in replacement for TOTP. But we try to solve this disadvantage of TOTP and not have any secrets stored on the server. The challenge with this kind of scheme is that one can easily see that the one-time password must be at least as long as the security parameter. And to see this, consider an attacker that hacks into the server, steals all the information on the server. He can then launch an offline attack, a brute force attack on the one-time password, and break the scheme. So the one-time password must be at least as long as the security parameter we want our scheme to have. On the other hand, we can't just have arbitrarily long one-time passwords, since in this kind of scheme, the user usually has to enter the password to the computer, and we don't want to put too much burden on the user. So we try to build a scheme that meets these requirements. And additionally, we give some new results on analysis of hash chains, which are the main building block for our scheme. And an additional new pebbling scheme for efficient traversal of hash chain for our setting that minimizes, in practice, the login time and the one-time password generation time in our scheme. So just to kind of get a sense of the design space here, consider this Strawman solution in which this problem can be easily solved by using public key crypto. So in this solution, the client would just have the secret key, and the server would have the public key, so no secrets on the server. The client can then issue a signature on a time-based counter using the secret key, relate to the server, and the server can verify the signature using the public key. So that looks good, but the problem is that standard signatures such as ECDSA, in order to get 128 bits of security, the standard signatures are 512-bit long. And even if we use kind of shorter signatures like compressed Schnorr signatures, these are still fairly long. So for example, for the same level of security, a 384-bit signature still requires 77 base 32 characters to encode it. And this is significantly longer than the 6-digit TOTP codes. So the starting point for building our scheme is the classic ASCII scheme devised by Lampard in the 80s. And at the heart of this scheme is a hash chain, which the client initializes by choosing some random salt value and a secret X. And the client uses these two values to traverse a hash chain several dozen elements long, so think of like 50 or 100 elements. And the elements on these chains are the one-time passwords. The initial passwords, which is the end of the chain, is sent to the server who stores it. And subsequently, in order to log in, the client can traverse this hash chain from the end to the beginning using the password one after the other. So in order to log in, the client just sends the server the next element in the chain from the end to the beginning, and the server can verify the password by hashing it and comparing it to the stored value. If the two values match, the authentication succeeds, and the server updates the stored value with the new password. In Lampard's scheme, passwords are 64 bits long, and remember, this is the 80s, so the passwords were carried on a piece of paper, encoded as 6-word phrases, and the user would just cross them out one after the other as he uses them. So this scheme does have certain limitations if we want to use it today. First of all, the scheme was designed in mind to support only a small number of logins, say 50 or 100 logins. And the one-time passwords in these schemes are not time-based. The fact that they're not time-based makes the security of the scheme have some problems. For example, it's easier to phish a one-time password, because if the attacker phishes a password, he has unlimited time, or at least until the user actually uses that password, to use the password himself. And second, in case that the multiple servers need to accept the same one-time passwords, they need to coordinate and be careful to update the state stored on the server after each successful authentication in order to reject the same password from being used again. Another problem in the design of the scheme is that the salt is used only in the first iteration, as we showed in the previous slide. And that makes the salt susceptible to pre-processing attack. Because if the attacker phishes or steals a one-time password, he can try to invert the hash chain using some pre-processed information without having to match the salt, because the salt is not used at each iteration. And finally, if we just try to naively improve this scheme and make it time-based, we're going to run into the difficulty that we don't really know what effect does the length of the chain have on the security. And specifically, we don't know how quickly does the security of the chain deteriorate when we are using longer and longer chains. And just to explain this in a bit more detail, consider an attacker that hashes some random value z to get an attack value p attack. This is kind of a candidate one-time password. This password has the potential of colliding with any of the k elements along the chain, k being the length of the chain. And so, if a chain is 1,000,000 elements long, this allows the attacker to have an attack which is 1,000,000 times faster, 1,000,000 times faster pre-image attack. And as a result, if we require to have the same level of security as the individual hash function, we actually need to use longer passwords in order to mitigate this risk. And this directly translates into 2 additional words in the passphrase, let's say for a hash chain of length 1,000,000. So how do we mitigate those problems? So we kind of need to change the hashing scheme that we use in our scheme. So just to explain our scheme in detail, first the client chooses a secret X and some salt value, and it also sets an expiration time. Think of it as like 4 years from now. After that period, the scheme will need to be reinitialized. The client and the server also, similarly to TOTP, share a time-based counter, and the counter advances in intervals, let's say, of 30 seconds. So initially, the client traverses the hash chain all the way from the secret to the initial password, and the length of the chain is set by the expiration time of the scheme. And we introduce 2 differences compared to ASCII. The first difference is that the salt is added as an input in each iteration of the hash function. And second, the time-based counter value at each point is also used as an input. And we're going to talk about the security advantages of that in a minute. So the final element in the chain, pinit, is sent to the server, who has to store this value, the salt, and the initial registration time. How does the authentication proceed after that? So given the time-based counter and all the information that the client have, in order to generate a one-time password, he traverses the segment of the chain, starting from the secret and ending with the counter value corresponding to the current time. This one-time password is relayed by the authenticating device, your laptop, to the server. To verify, the server traverses the remaining segment of the hash chain from the current time counter all the way to the element that he stores in his storage. Then the result is then compared against the stored value, and if the two match, then authentication succeeds and the values on the server are updated. So a quick calculation shows that if we want to support, if for our scheme to support 4 years of authentication using 30-second intervals, the chain has to be more than 4 million elements long. And using a chain of that length poses two concrete challenges. The first challenge is the security. And in detail, we need to understand whether the changes that we've made to the hashing schemes actually make our scheme secure when used in such a long hash chain. And second, the client now has to traverse a long hash chain each time to generate the one-time password. And we need to make sure that the performance of this scheme is actually reasonable and that the login latency is acceptable. So first we discuss security. And the security game that we consider in our work is just kind of the intuitive attack game that you can think of, is in which the attacker hacks into the server, he steals all the information stored on the server, maybe he also phishes some previous OTP, one-time password, and then he wants to generate a new one-time password. And one can easily show that in this setting, guessing a one-time password, a correct one-time password, requires inverting a segment of the hash chain. So we analyzed this security game in the random oracle model, and we show that for our scheme, when used with password length n and a hash chain of length k, then for an adversary to break the scheme, an adversary that makes at most t random oracle queries to the underlying hash function can only break the scheme with a probability that is 2t plus 2k over 2 to the n. So to parse that, I think the best way is to compare this expression with kind of the attack that I sketched earlier for the ASCII scheme. And the big difference is that the dependence on the length of the chain k is additive in our scheme versus being multiplicative in the old scheme. And this directly translates into the length of passwords that we allow ourselves to use. And specifically, this saves us 2 words using the ASCII dictionary encoding. Second, we also consider the security of our scheme against a stronger attack model, namely the attack model with preprocessing. And this is important to consider because in practice, the hash function used is not a random oracle, random function that the attacker has no clue about, but actually some fixed function, for example, SHA-256. And the attacker can have an unlimited amount of time to pre-process this function ahead of seeing the challenge, namely the one-time password that he wants to break. So in the first phase of the attack, the attacker can pre-process the hash function, store some advice string whose length we measure by the parameter s. And in the second phase, the attacker proceeds as before, namely making random oracle queries to the underlying hash function. And in our work, we show a time-space lower bound of this form for inverting a hash chain of, let's say, moderate chain length up to 2 to the n over 2, which is more than enough for practical uses. And the way to parse this expression is first notice that this expression is independent of k, at least in this parameter regime, which means that the security of the scheme does not deteriorate with the length of the chain. Second, notice the exponential dependence on the password length, which matches the best lower bounds we have for inverting a single function in the random oracle model. And third, we do note that the dependence on the success probability, there is some loss there compared to the best bounds for the single function case, and this leaves some room for future work to improve. We note that both the previous result and this result about hash chain could be of independent interest, as hash chains are relatively widely used primitive in various applications. Finally, we know that we show a version of this bound for the actual scheme we use for the salted scheme, following recent work from Eurogroup this year. And we show that salting kind of helps to beat pre-processing attack, at least at some effect, up to the fact that our bound is not completely tight. The second challenge that I'm going to discuss is that since we're dealing with much longer hash chains that have been used in ASCII, we need to make sure that the password generation is fast enough. And specifically, the scheme as I described until now requires the client to traverse the entire hash chain all the way from the secret to the point in the chain that corresponds to the current time. And this could be, like we talked, like millions of elements long. And traversing this chain, potentially on a computationally weak device, directly translates into a longer login latency. So the standard approach to solve these kind of problems when dealing with hash chains is to store some pre-computed checkpoints, often also called pebbles, along the chain. But for our specific application, we can slightly refine the model. And specifically, we can differentiate between the query time, which is the time it takes to, given the pre-computed data, to generate the current one-time password, and a potentially post-processing phase, which happens after the password is generated and could be used by the client to update the checkpoints and update the pre-computed data. And the reason is that, for this distinction, is that the second phase, although also important, does not directly translate into login latency, as the password is generated already after the first phase. And kind of taking this approach, we also see kind of the difference between the requirements for our pebbling scheme and previous approaches. Previous approaches consider the problem of sequentially traversing the hash chain. So this is in a setting where you need to output the elements of the chain one by one, and you care about the time that it takes to generate the next element and the total amount of work it takes to traverse the entire chain. Where in our case, the logins usually do not happen every 30 seconds, and so the access to the chain is kind of random access. You have those jumps between one authentication attempt, let's say the initial authentication attempt, and the next one. And we need to address this access pattern to the chain. So clearly, if you just care about the worst case time it takes to generate an element, the best thing you could do is to place checkpoints at equal distances, because that minimizes the maximal distance between any point and the checkpoint. But in practice, we will often have some prior knowledge on the distribution of logins in our system. For example, it could be the case that the user logs in every week, or the probability for the user not to log in for two years is very, very small. And kind of taking this illustration into the mind, looking at the login probability versus the position on the hash chain, you can see that if we just naively place the checkpoints at equal distances, we kind of do not optimize for the area of the hash chain in which the login probability is concentrated. So in our work, we actually try to devise a pebbling scheme for this setting, where the access is non-sequential, and we have some probability distribution, some prior knowledge on the login intervals. And as an example, we model logins as a Poisson process, which has been suggested before. And this corresponds to an exponential distribution, which I showed on the previous slide, of logins. And for this, we kind of show a heuristic that for the Poisson distribution can actually be solved analytically to find these heuristic checkpoint positions. And our evaluations show that comparing the naive equal distances checkpoints and our scheme, which targets this Poisson process distribution with a known mean, I should say, we get more than an order of magnitude improvement on the number of hash computations that need to be done on average. And we also show here kind of a comparison to previous pebbling scheme, but this is kind of an apples to oranges comparison because they optimize for a different access pattern to the scheme. Finally, I want to talk about our implementation. So we extended the Google Authenticator app for the client, and we wrote a Linux spam model for the server. And we kind of for an 80-bit security, we just use 8-word one-time passwords that the user needs to type in. And if we want, and one can reasonably want 128 bits of security, this translates into slightly larger one-time passwords. Or we can also have another mode in our app in which the one-time password can be encoded as a QR code, which the user then needs to scan using, let's say, the laptop, the camera on his laptop. And admittedly, both of these modes of operation have their disadvantages. One being the first one actually requiring the user to type in significantly longer. But given the requirements and given our desire to not have secrets on the server, there's kind of a trade-off here. And of course, thinking about better ways to do it would be great. Just to give a couple of words about evaluation, so we tested our scheme. We tested the behavior of our scheme on the 128-bit passwords, and kind of the bottom line is that the initialization takes less than half a minute, because then the client actually has to traverse the entire chain. But subsequently, the login, whether to generate the one-time password or to verify it on the server, is usually less than a second, which we think could be reasonable in many settings. So to conclude, we presented a second-factor authentication scheme without secrets on the server. And the main tool for our scheme is kind of a more detailed, a more careful construction of hash chains, which leads to one-time passwords which are significantly short than signatures. Along the way, we show kind of new bounds on the security of hash chains, which we think could be interesting for other applications of hash chains, and a pebbling scheme for non-sequential traversal of hash chains. And thank you for listening.
So is there some related work now, like thinking if you want, let's say, logarithmic, kind of worst-case logarithmic time, to both proof and verify, maybe based on Merkle tree traversal or something, is there some scheme like popular like that?
So we tried to think about, because that obviously would be significantly better than our scheme. The problem with that is that these kind of hashing schemes usually require some additional information to be passed each time you traverse a step. So if you only restrict yourself to the hash output being passed from the prover to the verifier, that we couldn't make any of those schemes work. But so I'm not.
So the Merkle tree traversal kind of doesn't work. Where every time you open one more image with authentication pass, that doesn't work.
I guess, for example, if you just take some Merkle tree construction, you would need to provide additional inputs to the server, or rather store more state on the server, I think, initially.
I see. So, okay. So maybe I'll ask offline, but thanks.
So if you use it in the mode in which you just type in the 8-word phrase, then you don't. And if you want, for 80-bit security, yes. For 128-bit security, you need 12 words. And if you want to use the camera, well, then yeah, you need to provide some to your browser or.
Do you have no further questions?